Welcome to the Missions Podcast, the show that explores your hard questions on missions, theology, and practice to help goers think and thinkers go. I'm Alex Kochman, Director of Communications and Media with ABWE. I am without my co-pilot Scott Dunford today, as at the time of this recording, he's getting back from Anaheim, California, which for those of you who are a part of the Southern Baptist world, you know that a lot has been happening in Anaheim this week. And so while we're without Scott due to a flight delay, we are with a very important guest. My guest today is Aaron Renn, who is the author of the Aaron Renn newsletter that you can get at Aaron Renn, R-E-N-N with two N's.com. He's also the host of the Aaron Renn Show, which you might know by its old name, The Masculinist. He's also written for multiple outlets, including Wall Street Journal and The Atlantic, and he is a consultant and a writer and a thinker on issues related to society, culture, church, and economics as well. So, Aaron, want to give you a chance to introduce yourself and tie in anything that we might have left out of that introduction.
Well, thanks for having me, and that was a great intro. I would only add that I'm also a co-founder and senior fellow of American Reformer, which is an organization focused on reinvigorating Protestant Christianity in the religious, political, and cultural life of America. And you can find that at AmericanReformer.org.
Very good. Well, we're happy to make the introduction here. And among all of your impressive credentials here, one of the things that prompted this conversation today was an article that you recently wrote for First Things called The Three Worlds of Evangelicalism. Tell our readers about that.
This article talks about America and Christianity during the period of Christianity's decline from its mid-century peak. If you go back to, say, 1950s, about half of all Americans attended church every Sunday. That was an all-time record high. Starting in the 60s, Christianity went into decline in terms of people going to church membership, but also in terms of essentially Christianity's status and the way that its moral teachings were seen in society. So I look at the period roughly from the Kennedy assassination to the present, and I analyze it in terms of three different periods in terms of how society views Christianity, what I call the positive, the neutral, and the negative world. And this is sort of a continuous period of decline. It's not always continuing to decline at the same speed, but it's a phase of decline. But at some point in this decline process, it hit kind of two tipping points that divided it into basically three phases. So in the positive world, well, which again, I would date from, say, 1964 to 1994, Christianity is in decline. All is not well with Christianity by any means in America, but it was still basically viewed positively. To be known as a good church-going man sort of boosted your social status. It made people want to hire you. Sort of like being known as a good family man. You'd be a hard worker because you had to feed your family, that sort of thing. It was part of being an upstanding member of society. And Christian moral norms, although called into question by the sexual revolution and among other things, were still basically the norms of society. Around about 1994 and extending through to about 2014, we entered what I call the neutral world, where Christianity is no longer seen positively, but it's not really seen negatively either. It's more like one option among many in a pluralistic public square. And then around 2014, we enter what I call the negative world, where for the first time in the 400-year history of America, society, certainly elite society culture institutions, now views Christianity negatively. Christian morality is expressly repudiated and is even seen as a threat to the new public moral order or even political order. So I talk about these three worlds, and then I talk about the different groups of people within evangelicalism and how they responded to them over times, and how they've struggled in this negative world to really grapple with the times. The end result being that what we used to call the culture war, which was this sort of evangelicalism plus some conservative Catholics versus this sort of emerging secular society. It was sort of evangelicalism versus the world. The culture war is now evangelical versus evangelical. Back in the 70s, they had that film Kramer versus Kramer, this divorce film. Well, now we have sort of evangelical versus evangelical, as there's, much like with Republican and Democratic politics and many other things in our society, there's been a lot of turmoil, a lot of realignment, a lot of rethinking, and a lot of conflict. So I sort of lay all of that out.
Those that listen to the show regularly know that Scott is a Gen Xer, I'm a millennial, and that informs some of the conversations that we have I'm used to this space where as Christians, we feel like we're on the losing side, and we're a little bit more abrasive in some of those conversations. We're more open to more of a direct confrontation with culture, whereas a lot of the Gen Xers were kind of living off of the last remaining fumes, right, of the positive world that you described that existed even prior to Xers. Maybe you can elaborate a little bit more upon how does this flesh out if somebody's looking for what would be some concrete examples, whether in culture, or society, or literature and media or politics, especially for those of us in the U.S. And if you're not in the U.S. listening, we're going to make application of that ahead as we get further into the conversation. But give us some handles on examples of that model that you'd flesh out.
Well, I'm also Gen X, so that really does inform how I see the world because we remember a lot of all of these. In the positive world, I identified two particular strategies or approaches. One was the culture war or religious right strategy you could associate with a Jerry Falwell or a Pat Robertson. And the second was the seeker-sensitive movement, and sort of what we could think of as today the non-denominational megachurches that we all kind of know. That's sort of what came out of that, sort of pioneered by people like Bill Hybels at Willow Creek or Rick Warren, who's just announced his retirement at Saddleback. And not all of those folks were boomers. Really, those models were really both baby boomer models dominated by sort of baby boomer mentality, in part because that positive world era really overlapped with the emergence into prime adulthood of this massive baby boomer cohort. Gen X people like me, we tended to operate in the shadows. We were not really driving much of anything institutionally or strategically. We still aren't to a great extent. There may never be a Gen X president, for example. We'll see. Not saying that there'll never be one, but the baby boomers have been running the show for a long time, and they're kind of still running it, or even kind of pre-boomers. And you get into the neutral world. The strategy I came up with was call it cultural engagement, which to some extent was almost the opposite of the culture war approach. Rather than fighting with the culture, why don't we sit down and have a conversation, listen, engage? This was the era of this sort of pluralistic public square. And, the people who were very much in this mode were people who thought, hey, Christianity has a lot to offer to the culture, even in this age. We don't have to fight with things all the time. And they also saw that there was good as well as bad in the culture. And again, a lot of these folks were also, baby boomers like Tim Keller in Redeemer Presbyterian Church, I think is a good example of what I've labeled a cultural engagement model. But there are a number of kind of Gen X and younger people in it as well. As you get into the younger cohorts, however, especially the Zoomers, the young people, as well as some of the younger millennials, you really do see that they're no longer satisfied with the old answers that they were given. Some are, reacting in very different ways. So it's not just one reaction. Some are very much, as you say, they're taking a more, call it new right approach, where they want to be essentially a culture war 2.0, but more effective than what they see as the ineffectiveness of the parents. The others are the ones who've kind of become, to some extent, the ex-evangelicals, the people who are deconstructing their faith, who've reacted very negatively to their parents' sort of boomer republicanism, and what they see is the hypocrisy and such of that. With they critiqued the immorality of Bill Clinton, but then supported Donald Trump. For example. So there's a lot of different people having a lot of different reactions. And of course, the older people like me or like those baby boomers, they're sort of having to try to adjust what they do to this world. But the point I make is in these previous two worlds, you had sort of strategies that were developed to respond to it, methods, approaches, whatever you want to call it. Whereas with the negative world, there really hasn't been a good negative world strategy come to the fore yet. There's Rod Dreher's Benedict option. And of course, Dreher's not an evangelical. He's Eastern Orthodox and formerly Catholic. And evangelicals didn't really go for the Benedict option at the time, probably, in part because you name it after a Catholic monk. Right. That doesn't play well, I think, in the Protestant world. But I also think there was a big sense of denial that, a lot of Protestants and evangelicals were just in denial about the new world. So the question is, what do we do today in order to adjust to changing times. I would say adaptability and being able to respond to cultural change has been one of the hallmarks of evangelicalism that has set it apart from the mainline tradition, which could not adapt, or the fundamentalist tradition, which sort of has survived in its rigidity, but was never able to sort of break out of, its ghetto. Perhaps you might think of it as. Evangelicalism and associative movements have been very much able to culturally change with the times. There's good with that. There's bad with that. And so that's why I'm a little bit surprised that nothing's come out of this negative world. And it may be that, in essence, there's still a lot of boomer domination of our culture, and that keeps us stuck in sort of a boomer frame of mind.
Well, briefly, before we dive into more and think about how this might intersect with missions, both in our own culture and abroad, what has surprised you most about some of the reactions that you've gotten to this article? I'm sure you've had positive, neutral, and negative world reactions to this article itself.
Yeah, I've mostly gotten very positive reactions, and the critics have convinced me that the model is fundamentally sound. So if you look at those three groups I mentioned, the culture war people, the seeker sensitives, and the cultural engagers, the culture war people I haven't got too much response from because they don't read magazines like First Things, right? They're not reading 4,000-word essays. They've got their own way that they engage with the world, and it's usually not about, reading people like me who, as you said, I've written for The Atlantic. I personally am more in a sort of cultural engagement style of life, in that I've lived in cities. I kind of like that urban culture. I'm not as negative towards society, maybe as my mom's generation was. So I think a lot of the culture war people don't really read me. Where I got the best reaction, though, was from the seeker-sensitive types, which is interesting because I really don't come from that background. I grew up in a rural Pentecostal fundamentalist background. And then today, I've been in kind of urban church, really as an adult Christian. So I really have never really attended one of these big suburban megachurches that you think of as the evangelical mainstream. But these are the people who really feel, wow, this is giving me a map to the new territory. This is helping me engage with and figure out the world. The most criticism has come from what I would label these cultural engagement folks. And maybe it's a little easier for me to critique them because I'm sort of on the inside a little bit. I see things firsthand. But I think it's understandable that they wouldn't like it because really what I'm saying is their model is somewhat obsolete as we go into a world where you're not going to be able to sit down and just have a pleasant conversation with the secular folks in this pluralistic public square. You're going to be ruled out of bounds from the world word go. So this new negative world does pose, I think, a greater threat to that model. I do think the culture war model is also kind of obsolete, but it can also, much like the fundamentalism, it can sort of survive as its own little self-contained universe, even if it becomes more culturally irrelevant. But the cultural engagers, they have a lot at risk.
One of the things that we try to do on the show, and by the way, if you haven't read the article, we'll include a link to that First Things article in the show notes. So if you're not sure, well, who's he talking about when he talks about the cultural engagement types, things like that, go ahead and take a look at that, and we recommend that as a resource and be thinking about that. But coming back to you, Aaron, one of the things that we try to do on the show is unify the worlds of mission, missiological thought with theology, with solid thinking about cultural engagement that comes from a theologically robust center. The reason that we do that is we find that sometimes those two worlds are kind of isolated. Maybe you have some of your own thoughts on missiology itself as a discipline. It's kind of an amalgam of a couple of different things. It's not strictly biblical or theological. It's also sociologically informed. There's ethnography that comes into it. It's kind of a Frankenstein of a bunch of different disciplines, sometimes for the better, sometimes not so much for the better. Where do you see some of those major influencers in mainstream conservative evangelical missiology fitting into this world? Think about those that came out of Pasadena and Lausanne and the U.S. Center for World Mission, Ralph Winter, Donald McGavran, and other voices too that are significant, Leslie Newbegin, Paul Hebert. Where do you plot them on this spectrum, and what worlds do they come from, or better yet, what worlds do they create, positive, neutral, or negative, in terms of the evangelicals' relationship with current Western culture?
I come from a management consulting background. That's my professional heritage. And then I worked in public policy at a think tank in New York. So I am not a theologian, not a missiologist. So I look at things much like a management consultant would. So that's really important to say. I never hold myself up as some sort of an authority on the Bible, in the sense that a pastor or a seminary trained, theologian would be. I'm sort of looking at this a little bit more like a business analyst or a policy analyst type would. And when it comes to mission, to be candid, I'm not at all an expert on kind of missions or evangelism. I'm not sure that I fully know all of the people that you're talking about. I do see a couple of these models as having a sort of a missional focus, in the sense that the seeker-sensitive models, they sort of tried to figure out why. In the 70s, Bill Hybels went door to door and knocking on doors, and he was asking people if they went to church. And if they didn't go to church, he's like, why didn't you go to church? And he's like, let me find out how to remove the barriers to going to church. And that brought a lot of people in the door. I think the Keller model of doing church in New York City, how to adapt to this very different culture, which he had to learn over time. Okay, what works with New Yorkers? How do we talk about issues? How do we address the things that are relevant to their life? Also had a very missional focus in terms of evangelism. One guy who's interesting is Leslie Newbegin. He was this, missionary in India, and then he kind of came back. And I believe he got back to England in the 70s, took a look around and said, wow, this is a culture that needs to be evangelized again. We're now living in essentially a pagan culture. And I think he, at that time, really saw this decline of Christianity happening. So guys like him, I think, saw, he didn't live in what I call the negative world. He lived in the positive world. But nevertheless, he could see that things were not going well. And even back in that 70s era, he saw there's trouble. And all these guys saw there were trouble. The moral majority culture war types, they saw that the trends were going against them, and they decided to fight back. The seeker-sensitive types saw that people were not going to church, and they tried to figure out how to adapt, which was successful. The mainline denominations, which were going into decline at that time, they did, a lot of research. There was a massive amount of research done in the 1970s about why the main lines were in decline. And they were never able to adapt. And so they've continued to go into decline. So I do think, sort of mission and reaching people was a component of what some of these people were trying to do. But in terms of how it relates to the discipline of missiology directly, I can't say. I will say, I was just going to address the American point. I do take a very kind of America-centric model. This evangelical culture that we have in America is much less present in other places. Certainly, some of the trends that caused changes in the relationship between, Christianity and society that affected us also affected other countries. So one of the factors that really started the process of decline was sort of the 60s social revolutions, which certainly had their analogs in Europe with May 1968 and all of those things. The Cold War was a layer on it. But this is very much an America-centric model of looking at the world. I do think there are cultures, maybe in Europe, where official culture, official institutions are negative to Christianity. It's traditionally understood. But the relationships between Christianity and society are very different there than they are here. Some of those countries are very heavily Catholic and come from a Catholic background, for example, whereas America is a Protestant country. So, there's a lot of differences.
Well, and that's helpful, and I want to move the conversation in that direction, because your framework does really apply in an American context, even though you're using the words worlds to describe things. It's dynamics in the relationships that we see here in the U.S. I'd love to begin to think about how missionaries might put in similar paradigms into their thinking, and which type of world is my mission field would be a good question. But there's other models too. So what do you feel gives your model merit over, say, a Niebuhr model, which, if you're familiar with Richard Niebuhr, he has his Christ in culture, and there's 5 different postures there, and it's Christ in paradoxical sort of continual back and forth with culture, right? Christ over culture, Christ in culture, sort of assimilating, and there's a few more postures that he describes. But what makes yours uniquely helpful for somebody trying to live on mission or be an influence in the United States right now versus other models that theologians, missiologists have contributed in the past?
Niebuhr's Christ in Culture is a landmark work published in 1951. What he is doing and what I am doing are 2 different things, as near as I can tell. Niebuhr is really fundamentally concerned with the theological relationship between reason and revelation. So in essence, there's Christ's law, or, the revealed will of God, through Christ, say the Sermon on the Mount. And then there's the natural law, which we don't have access to directly, but comes to us through culture. So culture is sort of a word to think about, sort of the reason and natural law and the created order. How do those 2 things relate? How do we reconcile them? And it might seem like some of mine map to his. So you might say, oh, the culture war, that's the Christ against culture model. But in his view, Christ against culture is not that kind of a fight. It's really saying Christ's law is supreme, and, natural revelation and all of that is to essentially be discarded. And so he would talk about, for example, the Apostle John and book of 1 John, where it talks about stay away from the world, think of culture as the world, and create this sort of more perfect Christian community of brotherly love from, in accordance with Christ's law. His great exemplar is Tertullian. So you think of a Tertullian, I believe he's the one that says, what does Athens have to do with Jerusalem? What does culture have to do with Christ? And rather than a high conflict model, like the culture war model, a Christ against culture person might withdraw from society, more like the monks went into a monastery to create this more perfect community of Christ-like love, following the Christian world there. So what he's doing is really talking about, I think, the theological relationship between reason and revelation, more so than here's how society looks at the world today, here's how we can do it tomorrow. I think there are many different ways you could look at the world. And there's really 2 elements of what I come up with that I think you could create models to apply in other cultures. One is, what is the story arc of religion and Christianity in the country in question? Is it a pre-Christian country? Is it a Christianizing country? Is it a post-Christian country? So you could think of a model like that. Is it a primarily, irreligious country? Is there an incumbent, official faith? So there's a lot of ways to look at it that way. So I think telling the story arc of kind of religion and say, what are the sort of periods or phases, and try to come up with 3 or 4. Consultants love to use 2x2 models, in which you create like a quadrant diagram, and you could do something like that. But I do think thinking about the story arcs and then thinking about how do you decompose, the church or different religious or social actors into different groupings. I took evangelicals, so I took a subset of Christians in America. I did not look at mainline Protestants. I did not look at Catholics or Orthodox. I didn't look at Jews. Typically in, religious surveys, Black Protestants are called out as their own group. The dynamics in the Black church are completely different than, traditional evangelical churches. So I took a subset and I said, let's decompose them into these 3 groups, culture war, seeker-sensitive, cultural engagement. You could have certainly sliced it in different ways. For example, there's a guy named Brad Vermeulen, who's a sociologist. He did his dissertation on the New Calvinist movement, and he looked at evangelicalism and divided it into movements like Neo-Anabaptist, Emerging Church, New Calvinism, Mainstream Evangelical. So there's a lot of different ways you could decompose things into groups. There's people I didn't really look at. So I didn't focus a lot on Pentecostals. I didn't talk a lot about the Jesus movement. I didn't talk really about the Neo-Anabaptist or all that much. But that's a tool. Think about, okay, what is the population of people I'm going to look at, and how does that work? So you could say, look, I'm going into a Nordic country. These tend to be Lutheran with establishment churches, not necessarily a lot of religious practice, but what's the landscape there? And if I'm, say, an evangelical missionary, how do I look at that world? That's sort of how I would suggest this is ways to think about it. So tell that sort of story arc of the past with regard to religion and Christianity, then look at the players in the landscape and say, how do we make sense of what's going on, and see if you can fit them together in figuring out like how you can respond to what's going on in the culture missionally. If I were looking at the problem, that's how I would address it.
That's helpful. Yeah, anyone in any culture can do that. What is the story arc of Christianity's engagement with that culture? But I also want to make this practical for people. I don't think you would have necessarily, and I don't want to speak for you, I don't know that you would have written this article 20 or 30 years ago when it felt a lot more like we were living in a culture that was neutral towards Christianity. In other words, it's the time in which we live now that really necessitated it, right? Necessity is the mother of invention. It's because we live in this this negative world. Let's think about, what does that mean for us? It's the month of June at the time of this recording, right? We're seeing pride everywhere. What does that mean for a biblical Christian with a biblical sexual ethic, biblical worldview, all those sorts of things? So what would be your encouragement? I think a lot of your audience is you're aiming at people who have not really yet come to grips with the fact that we are living in this kind of a space. And in some countries where we send missionaries, that's the space where they are all the time. In the Islamic world, that is a negative space towards Christians. What counsel would you give to pastors, students, missionaries, regardless of where they live, on how to live in a negative world, or what kind of things to be thinking about to be missional in a negative space?
I would not presume to tell someone how to try to be a missionary in the Islamic world or in a non-Western culture. Right. I've thought more, again, about the United States. As I develop this material, I'm trying to think, okay, what should we do now? That may be one of the criticisms. Okay, Aaron, you're great at diagnostician. You can tell us what's going on, but what are we going to do about it? So I think this might apply more in a Western kind of Christendom type context.
Naturally, us North Americans, we're pragmatic. What do I do? Give me practical steps, right? Yeah.
I think there's a couple things I would just say, a couple of themes that I hit. One is, there's a lot of pain in this world. And there's a lot of people who are being steered in directions that are designed to do them great harm. We're being told a lot of things that simply aren't true about the path that leads to human flourishing. For example, there's a lot of propaganda out there sort of arguing to defer marriage, to, maybe have no kids, fewer kids. Some of that is a result of, material forces and other trends, but it's also a result of ideologies. And so what happens, we end up with people who, get later in life and they're like, they wake up and say, wait a minute, I'm not married. I don't have any kids. I'm in my 40s or now my 50s. And wow, when I'm old and sick in a hospital, nobody's going to come visit me. And so that's just an example of the sorts of life. There's people suffering from drug addiction, like crazy, the opioid deaths that are here, the crime in some of these neighborhoods, and in the decay and the physical environments. So I think being like the safe harbor, I think whenever there's pain, and I'm copying this from an old pastor of mine, he says, he was in Chicago. He's like, there's a lot of pain in this city, but whenever there's pain, that's an opportunity for the light of the gospel to shine brighter. So how can we be the lighthouse to kind of guide people into the safe harbor? Both, I think, from giving them better truth about the world, but also, bringing them to Jesus, who is someone that speaks, I think, particularly to the afflicted. And there's a lot of afflicted people today who, to whom the gospel message, I think, would be very appealing. And I think you see that in like a lot of Latin America, or, where I grew up, where there's a lot of Pentecostal churches in sort of, working class communities. A lot of people there are suffering from severe problems, drug addiction, coming out of jail, maybe people who are recovering from having been sexually abused. My old church that I grew up in, right, the chaplain of the jail attends there. And this is a religion that appeals to people who are in a lot of pain or who are struggling with serious problems in life, because these are people who, in a very visceral way, understand their need for the power of the Holy Spirit and the gospel of Jesus Christ to transform their life. The second thing I'd say is, related to that is we need to be a source of truth. I think a lot of the seeker-sensitive and cultural engagement teachings were very what I call triangulating. Triangulation was this term in politics that was used to describe the way that people like Bill Clinton and Tony Blair sort of pivoted to the center and tried to co-opt all these ideas. And it's sort of this third way approach. And I think clarity of truth and just being able to be a source of just truth and not trying to essentially massage everything into this package is going to be important to people, because there's a lot of lies being told out there in the world, and a lot of people who could be damaged by those lies. And so where I think that, the culture war people, maybe they didn't have all the truth, but they were sort of trying to maybe even wielding the truth as a weapon or trying to use it as a political weapon. I don't think we need to do that, but I think helping people to see this is the truth is important. I think those are two things that I'm thinking about, particularly for Church in America.
One thing that I've seen from the perspective of someone serving on the sending side in a mission organization is, and we dropped a couple names of missiologists. Some our listeners may know, some they may not know. We talked about Leslie Newbegin. You talked about him. One of the other names that I brought up briefly was Donald McGavran. And Donald McGavran gave us the homogeneous unit principle, which was originally in the context of the mission field, recognizing how, well, like attracts like, basically, and the gospel spreads most easily along continuous ethno-linguistic lines, right, within a culture. Near neighbor evangelism, the gospel spreads more continuously. There's more continuity to evangelism, to ministry efforts that way. But that is what became the germ that formed the seeker-sensitive movement. It was that gave us biker churches and thinking about how homogeneous youths groups stick together, don't they? That was the basis on which you have people that then combine that with a North American marketing mindset, whether it's your Willow Creek, whether it's your Saddleback. That's what essentially gives you that model of church and of ministry. And really seeing that, even though this was a missiological insight gained from cultures where there may be little to no history of Christianity, that really comes in to a neutral setting, a neutral world setting in the United States. And it succeeds only in that time period. I think now, frankly, post-COVID, I think in a lot of ways we're seeing the death of that seeker-driven attractional church model. I think that logic has sort of caved in on itself a little bit. And I think for missionaries who took that same thinking into their work on the mission field, I think they've got to see beyond that as well, that homogeneous units work together and form together under normal circumstances. But sometimes there are factors and forces at play in a culture that are bigger than just those ethnic or tribal loyalties, and those affinity loyalties that we see are so polarizing and divisive in our own culture. And really, we have to trust the Spirit of God to assimilate people into the church that may or may not belong to homogeneous groups, that may or may not have something in common with us externally. I think for missionaries, what that means is that they've sort of, and pardon the expression, but that they kind of have to get red-pilled a little bit about contextualization, in the sense that, yes, culture matters, language matters. We have to acquire culture and language and speak understandably to our neighbors around us. But just recognizing that that's not going to be the silver bullet that wins them to Christ. What's going to win them to Christ is going to be, like you're talking about, being a source of truth, being uncompromising, unapologetic in presentation of the gospel, recognizing that should have always been in our theology all along, but recognizing only that the gospel of Jesus Christ is going to be the only decisive thing that adds a person to our church, that adds a person to the kingdom, and not our attempts to contextualize. One thing I want to ask you real quick, your context and a lot of where you've seen the cultural engagement types has been in those urban settings. You're an urban sociology researcher. That's one of your areas of consulting. For a while, urban ministry was kind of the new hotness in evangelicalism. Are you seeing that increase? Are you seeing that fade away? And in those spaces in particular, this is really relevant, right? Because those are the places that in many ways are the most where we see the negative world, as you would call it, at play.
Yes. Again, I have great experience in the rural because I lived in a rural world a very long time, and I know that very well. And, I've lived in the urban world. It's the hardcore, full-on suburbs that I have the least personal experience with. Definitely the urban church model still seems to be a very hot thing. I noted the other day, if you go to the SBC's website, sbc.net, Southern Baptist Convention, click on their About page. It's a picture of the Manhattan skyline. I mean, that tells you so much about that denomination.
Southern Baptists, yes, right.
You know,
yes,
the Southern
exactly.
Baptists. And by the way, that's one of the things that I do. I look at something like that and I see an incongruity there. And those usually tell me there's something going on there, that probably some stuff going on, that something worth keeping an eye on. But anyhow, that you can see their focus is on big cities. My understanding is most of their church planting efforts are very focused in the big city. There's mix and matching of two different things typically. There's the phenomenon of urbanization globally, and then there's the resurgence of central cities domestically in the United States, and those can often get conflated. The fact is, as speaking of missiologists, Ray Bakke, I guess you'd call him an urban missiologist, he's like, look, the city is the primary mission field of the future on all 6 continents because we are becoming an urbanized world. You know, as you know, recently as 1910, only 10% of the people on planet Earth lived in cities. Today, we're over 50%. We're projected to go to 75% by mid-century. Urbanization is a massive phenomenon in Asia, in Africa, across the world. People have been moving from rural to urban. So in terms of missional focus, the focus is going to be on cities just by virtue of the demography. I always use the analogy to Willie Sutton's famous line. They ask him why he robbed banks. He says, because that's where the money is. Why are you going to focus on cities? Because that's where the people are going. And we're seeing it all over the world. Urbanization is happening. There are more people living in urban slums, right, in favelas, whatever you want to call them, in the world today than the total combined population of the United States and Europe. Think about that. How do you reach a favela? This is a huge challenge, and this is where, you know, the people are going. In the United States, we've long been an urban country. We hit 50% urban in 1920. We're characterized as 80% urban today. The reality is we're probably more like 70% urban once you strip off some things. Most of our population, though, is what we think of as suburban. Nevertheless, these sort of urban centers are important because, one, there are people there and they need the gospel. Secondly, that is where the culture of society is being shaped. So if you want to have some role in that in any way, you know, where is Disney? Where is Google? Right? Where is JP Morgan Chase? Where is the federal government? Where is CBS? Right? Where is the New York Times? Where is Harvard? They're in these places. These core culture-shaping institutions, the major foundations and NGOs, et cetera, that's where they are. And as you know, this is where the pressure of the negative world is more intense. So these serve as a sort of R&D lab for the church in figuring out how to adapt to the culture. And if, you know, many of these urban church movements fail, well, we can learn from them about what not to do, can't we? So I do think cities are important, but there's a lot of, I think, somewhat justified blowback about this idea of urban triumphalism. You know, the Harvard economist Ed Glazer wrote this book, The Triumph of the City. City people tend to feel very high on cities. There's a lot of triumphalist rhetoric, and they often draw on this global urbanization phenomenon to tell you how important the cities are, even though domestically it's quite a different story when you really think about it. Nevertheless, cities are still very important. We simply can't neglect cities. Of course, we can't neglect anywhere. I always think, you know, people feel a certain affinity or a certain call or have a certain gift to a certain place. You know, there are going to be people, you know, I gave some support to some missionaries to my old church who were in Mongolia. Very traditional, what you think of as very traditional missionary work. Other people, they are figuring out how to, you know, minister in, say, a slum in Rio. How do you do that? Very important to figure all of the above out.
It is important, and I love, as we conclude, I love one thing that you said earlier, which I think is so good to camp out on, which is that we get in these conversations about how do we engage in these negative world spaces, right, where there's this highly combative relationship between the morality or immorality of culture, the worldview of culture versus biblical Christianity. And yet, if we do anything else, we need to stand for the truth, and we also need to be there for the hurting, because it's one thing to only engage those voices that are the loudest in their opposition. It's another thing to realize that any society whether however successful or unsuccessful that society is always going to have its underclasses, its hurting, its broken people that are just, by virtue of their station in life, more prepared for the gospel than some of those who are going to be our loudest critics on the cultural stage. So I think there's some really good insights that you've shared. I think there's so much more that we could unpack, but we've really just scratched the surface. So Aaron, what would you recommend for further reading or listening on this topic, and how can people get a hold of you and subscribe?
Everybody should go to my website, aaronrenn.com. That's AARONRENN.com, and sign up. There's lots of content there, and I always include in Weekly Digest everything that I do from all those sites. And also check out American Reformer at AmericanReformer.org.
Very good. Well, Aaron, thank you so much for joining us, and thank you for watching or listening, however you're tuning into the Missions Podcast today. The Missions Podcast is a ministry of ABWE. To learn more, go to missionspodcast.com or go to abwe.org. And if you'd like to partner with us, we are grateful for the generosity of our supporters. You can do so at missionspodcast.com/support. Of course, the best way that you can support the show is by leaving a positive rating and review in your podcast platform of choice. That does help the algorithm serve this up to more people that can be blessed by it. And so do that for us and leave a comment. And if you want to reach out to us with any ideas for a guest or a future topic that we can cover, email alex@missionspodcast.com. Until next time, thank you for watching or listening.